Whakayu I mate waiki mate uraru. Do not die like an octopus, die like a hammerhead shark. A Maori proverb. Despite years of dispossession and disadvantage since the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi and the New Zealand Wars of the 1860s, Maoris were more politically influenced in their own countries than their counterparts of Canada, South Africa and Australia. There were 4 seats in New Zealand Parliament reserved for Maori, and legally, though not always in practice, Maoris were entitled to the same rights and privileges as the Pakehas, or the white New Zealanders. When Britain declared war on Germany, New Zealand Prime Minister William Massey committed New Zealand to the Empire War effort. In New Zealand, the question was about indigenous participation, not about the Maori inequality with Pakehas, so much so over the British would react to the Maori soldiers. In New Zealand, the question was about indigenous participation, not about the Maori inequality with the Pakehas, so much over how Britain would react to the Maori soldiers. Already in August 1914, several Maori chiefs were offered to send Maori soldiers to the front line. The 5 Maori MPs, the 4 reserved seats plus 1 Maori MP, Sir James Carroll, asked the New Zealand government to make a accommodation for the Maori enlistments. Initially, the government indicated that it was against the wishes of Britain for non-Europeans to participate in a conflict between members of the white race. Very soon, though, the government became aware of the First Nations troops stationed in Egypt. Prime Minister Massey announced on the 16th of September 1914 that the British had lifted the bar on non-white races joining up and acceded to requests for Maoris to serve. Theoretically, Maoris could join the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, the NZEF, the same as the Pakehas New Zealanders, and approximately 40 of them did. However, the War Office suggested the formation of 2 Maori forces of 250 members each, one to go to Egypt and the other one to Samoa, which New Zealand forces had conquered from Germany without resistance in August at the outbreak of the war. The Minister of Defence delegated responsibility for Maori recruitment to the Maori members of Parliament. Rather than considering the Maori contingent to be a form of unequal segregation, the Maori members of Parliament, and more widely the Maori Iwa tribes, were supportive of the war effort, considering a separation of Maori units to be an opportunity to keep Maori boys together and to showcase their abilities as warriors. The call for Maori enlistees went through the Maori Gazette Kahati, and with the support of most Iwa chiefs, they easily recruited 500 men required for the Maori contingent. Though the original plan was to send half to Samoa, officials privately expressed worries about the tensions between the Samoans and the Maori occupiers, who the Samoans considered the inferior race. Officials publicly cited the desire of the Maori MPs and the Iwa chiefs to keep the Maoris together, and the plan changed to send a united Maori contingent to Egypt. The Maori contingent had been trained in Avalondale since October 1914, and on the 14th of February 1915 they set sail. The Maori contingent arrived in Egypt on the 26th of March 1915, and shortly thereafter they were sent to Malta for training and garrison on duty. It was never envisioned that the Maori contingent would be an infantry combat force, primarily because of fears that there would not be enough reinforcements to maintain the unit. Instead, the Maori contingent's original role was to serve as pioneers, infantry soldiers who did much of the non-combat physical labour required to support the front lines, digging trenches, setting up barbed wire, building roads, transporting munitions, food and water, and performing other unskilled and semi-skilled labour. They did not mean that the Maoris were regulated to safe positions, rather an infantry unit who would still undergo regular training and could be sent to the front lines if it was needed, but not as combat soldiers most of the time. The plans for the Maori contingent at Malta changed rapidly in light of the dire situation confronting the Anzacs after the Gallipoli landings on the 25th of April 1915. Given the heavy losses the New Zealand Expeditionary Force suffered, commanders made the decision to send Maori contingents to support the New Zealand Mountain Rifle Brigade. The Maori contingent arrived at Gallipoli on the 3rd of July 1915 and very quickly found themselves enduring the same hardships as the rest of the Anzacs, including heat, exhaustion, Turkish rifle fire, disease, privation, flies and lice, and of course rats, and snakes and scorpions. As the Allied commanders at Gallipoli planned for the August offensive, the roles of the Maori contingent shifted into action combat. From the 6th of August, the Maori contingent was broken up and members were sent to reinforce the 4th New Zealander Mountain Rifle Regiments, which were only operating at half strength. Their mission was to seize the summits of Sal Alabar. The attack began on the night of the 6th of August, and the Maoris were in the front and the centre of the assault. It was said that the Maoris chanted the haka, the war dance, each time they took a Turkish trench, cheering "Chamit, Chamit, Chamit, Ura, Ka, Ura." We may die, we may die. We live, we may live. On the 8th of August, the Maoris took part in the brutal attack of Chunuk Bir, where the New Zealand Expeditionary Force suffered heavy losses before withdrawing during the night on the 9th of August. Out of 400 Maori men, there were 17 killed, 82 wounded and 2 missing. For the remainder of the Gallipoli campaign, the surviving Maori contingent was broken up and its members attached to the New Zealand 4th Army battalions. They would still serve in drastically Maori platoons, but the lack of united Maori contingent identity disheartened the Maoris in the battlefield and back at home in New Zealand. By the time the Anzacs withdrew from Gallipoli on the 14th of December 1915, only 2 officers, 132 soldiers from the Maori contingent remained. Despite the Maori earning a reputation as an excellent soldier, their reduced numbers meant the disbandment of the Maori contingent. In 1960, more Maoris had enlisted and arrived in Egypt. In New Zealand, there was Maori outcry over the contingent's disbandment, and the elders threatened to withdraw support for further recruitment. In response, General Sir Alexander John Godley, commander of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, combined the remnants of the Maori contingent, the newly arrived 2nd and 3rd Maori contingents, and the survivors of the Otago Mounted Rifles to form the New Zealand Pioneer Battalion. The Otago Mounted Rifle members were Pakehas, but the vast majority of the Pioneer Battalions were Maoris, with a smattering of the Nuni Islanders and the Rarotonganas. Initially, the company commanders were Pakehas, but by 1917, almost all company commanders were Maori. The New Zealand Pioneer Battalion was sent to the Western Front, arriving in Mashele on the 9th of April 1916, and very quickly put into work felling trees. By May, they were in the combat zone at Amathris, where they were teaching non-commissioned officers trench building and wire techniques. Some Pioneer Battalion members were working on the front lines and were almost among the casualties. On the 9th of July 1916, the Maori participated in one unsuccessful large-scale raid on the German trenches. Despite using the Maori language as a secret code, they were not able to pass the uncut wires and take the German trench. This was the only large-scale raid which included the Pioneer Battalion. Henceforth, they would partake in some smaller raids, but generally they returned to their core labour duties, often still under fire, such as digging trenches, building roads, and constructing bunkers. In August 1916, the New Zealand Pioneer Battalion moved to the Somme battlefield. The pioneers were responsible for digging many of the communication trenches under regular shelling and gassing. The British units were so impressed with the Pioneer Battalion that they referred to them as the Digging Battalion. The entire New Zealander division, including the Pioneer Battalion, suffered heavy casualties on the Somme and regularly required reinforcements. By 1917, the Pioneer Battalion consisted of the Maori Companies A, C, and D, with the Pakehas as Company B. Commanders gave 49 Maori soldiers who were serving in other sections of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force the option to transfer into the Pioneer Battalion. Only 8 took the offer. The French public enjoyed the Maori songs and the haka performances. The Maoris were also brought out to perform ceremonies such as the haka when dignitaries visited the New Zealand divisions. The Maoris interacted with French farmers and also forged many intimate friendships with the Pakehas that were often the case in New Zealand. Maoris participated in rugby matches against the French army sides, opening with the haka, which was a tradition back in New Zealand. During the war, there were few disciplinary problems, though on New Year's Eve 1918 to 1919, after the war had ended, there was a breakdown of discipline when one soldier shot and killed an officer, and 2 Maori soldiers were convicted of rape. Throughout the war, the majorities of the Maoris iwi pledged support to the war effort. Many chiefs saw this duty for citizenship and also recuperated obligations to honour the Treaty of Waitangi. Maoris also expressed support through setting up of organisations to raise money for both general war effort and to support the Maori returned servicemen. Maori women were particularly active in some of these associations. Maori. The casualties of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force suffered at both Gallipoli and then at the Western Front strained the force's manpower. On the 1st of August 1916, the New Zealand Parliament passed the Military Service Act, introducing conscription to New Zealand. Recruitment to the Maoris had slowed down through 1916, which was not too dissimilar to the Pakehas. On the 26th of June 1917, the Defence Minister finally extended the application of the Military Service Act to Maoris. Some chiefs who iwi were regularly provided troops since the beginning of the war considered this move to be an insult, but the government officials calmed them down by indicating that the purpose for extending the conscription was primarily targeted to those iwi's members who were not enlisting. The iwi which the New Zealand government, with the support of the Maori MPs, targeted for conscription of those who were in the Waikato-Manatopo land district. There the Tainu and the Taranaki people had been the principal losers of the New Zealander wars, and many of them were loyal to Tirata Mutata, king of the Maoris. Since the beginning of the war, Tarata had proclaimed that he would not stand in the way of people enlisting, but he was also not encouraging it. The king's position was reinforced with sentiments among the Tunuli and the Taranaki people who did not want to join up, and the enlistment numbers for these Irites were negligible. The Maori MPs indicated that the main reason for this particular iwis were not enlisting because of the lingering resentment over the New Zealand wars. Notwithstanding opposition and peaceful protests from the Waikato district, the government enforced conscription against them until the duration of the war. The first Maori drafts occurred in February 1918, with over half of these selected failing to show up on their medicals. By the end of the war, 552 Maoris registered in 4 ballots. Out of the 298 found fit, only 74 were put into training, with 11 in prison with hard labour, 100 more being arrested, and arrest warrants had been issued but not executed for the further 100 draftees when the armistice was declared. Of the 74 conscript Maoris, they had never seen any overseas service. Throughout the war, one theme that permeated military reports, personal correspondence, and media was the construct of the Maori as a martial race. The concept of a martial race is the belief that one particular race or ethnic groups were biologically suited towards militarism. Maoris long held a reputation for their fighting prowess since the first encounters with the Europeans. Maori culture did indeed also esteem to the men who would prove themselves worthy in battle. Maori culture notions of a warrior were not the same as a European racial construct, yet both Maori and the Pakehas drew the ideas of the martial race during the First World War. The New Zealand media regularly deemed the military service as an opportunity for the Maori to exercise their inherent warrior abilities. While the intent of the newspaper articles were to praise Maori service, the constant references to the Maori with their expressions such as the sons of noble ancestors, the fighting race, and having warrior blood were merely enforced by the stereotypes of the martial race. The Maori MPs regularly asserted the warrior tradition as they pushed their agenda to enlist Maori servicemen. Even after the war, prominent war-era Maori MP Sir Mau Paura asserted the galvanic current of battle stirs the warrior blood within the ancestors' chieftain in their veins, and they asked that they might be allowed to go on the fighting line. Maori soldiers also appropriated the martial race myth to suit their needs on and off the battlefield. While in Malta, Maori invoked their heritage when arguing to join the Anzacs at Gallipoli. Maori letters home suggest that they considered success on the battlefield an opportunity to prove the worth of the Maori race to the Europeans. At times, though, the martial race concept conflicted with individual Maori soldiers growing disillusioned and with trauma, sometimes invoking the martial race as a coping strategy for soldiers traumatized by the horrors of war and when they lost their friends. At the end of August 1917, the Pakehas Company B of the New Zealander Pioneer Battalion was broken up and its members transferred into other infantry units. There were now significant Maori reinforcements to fill all 4 companies, so now all 4 members of the battalion were Maoris or Pacific Islanders. On the 1st of September 1917, the commanders rebadged it to the New Zealand Maori Pioneer Battalion, which would remain for the rest of the war. The Pioneers served at Passchendaele in October 1917, working to keep the roads open. After the loss there, the remaining Rototangians left in January 1918 to the Rokotan Company in Palestine, further reinforcing the Pioneers Battalion identity as a Maori unit. In the wake of the German push, the Pioneer Battalion rushed back to the Somme in late March 1918, where they were responsible for laying barbed wire between French villages. The strength of the battalion was still at least 900 men strong, which was stronger than any other Dominion infantry battalion. The Pioneer Battalion was part of the New Zealand Division's final victory, capturing the town of Le Queston on the 4th of November 1918. After the armistice of the 11th of November, the New Zealand Division was sent to the German border in late December to occupy Cologne. At the last minute, while en route, the British government decreed that the Pioneer Battalion should not continue but instead would return home. The British government recognized that the German authorities and civilian populations were subject to the occupations by a supposedly inferior race. As such, the British reinstated pre-war codes barring non-whites from participating in European wars. The New Zealand Maori Pioneer Battalion became a casualty of this policy, and the Maori members certainly resent it. The Pioneer Battalion departed England on the 28th of February 1919 and arrived back in New Zealand on the 6th of April. At the end of the First World War, 2,227 known Maori and 456 Pacific Islanders served overseas with the New Zealand Maori Pioneer Battalion, or the precursor, the Maori contingent. There were 1,070 casualties, 336 dead, 734 wounded. The total Maori enlistment and conscription numbers were 2,816, which 5.3% were Maori population. Maori once again answered the call to arms in the Second World War. In October 1939, the New Zealand Department of Defence commissioned the 28th Maori Battalion. Unlike the First World War, the predecessor of the 28th Maori Battalion was an infantry combat unit that saw direct action in Greece, North Africa, and Italy. The 28th Maori Battalions formed a significant part of the New Zealand national memory. The flip side to this strong position in New Zealand's national consciousness was the result of the First World War Pioneer Battalion had not held a prominent place in New Zealand national memory. But in the 1990s and in 1995 into the 2000s, the Maoris were finally dug up, and since 1926, since the first book was published on the Maori Battalion and the Maori participation in World War One, it was finally published in 1995 with a memograph and all that kind of stuff. So long lives the legacy of the warrior tradition, the waka, and other rugby intimidation dances. The Maoris, the Pacific Islanders of a warrior tradition. They never died, and if we all die, we all die. If we all live, we all live. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the episode. Kind of rushed because the mic's not working for some reason. Pretty weird. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. And if you're inquiring that the Maoris were treated indifferently, they were actually treated very well. The 5 MPs, and then there was still the equal rights, though not always in practice, but they were still legal. So they were actually, the Maoris were actually the most well-off Dominion that we have to cover. South Africa being the worst, Canada being mildly generous. Let's see, Australia being totally hardline, but not on the same as South Africa. And Newfoundland is, well, Newfoundland. So hope you enjoyed and hope you learned something. See you next time.